Okay, welcome back to the second part of the lecture. So, as I was telling you, the media globalization in countries such as ours, the underdeveloped world, could be traced back to the idea of the advent of the satellite television. Now, in 1990s, the coverage of international or media global media into countries such as ours was very limited. These were mainly local productions that we had. We did not have any global signals. It was in 1991 with the Gulf War that we first began to receive signals of international channels such as CNN, and we were what you say the first to receive in Asia. Thus, this kind of signals which would be considered today a normalcy. So, what happened is, after the 1990s, satellite television slowly started to take place in countries in Asia and Africa. So, satellite television became normalcy. So, what happened with satellite television was we started to see a lot of foreign media coming into our country. Now, this were mostly Western media, of course, and this were showing us the world in a way in which we had never perceived. But it impacted local program practices as well. So, audience viewing rituals in countries such as ours was impacted. Local program production practices across the world, particularly in peripheral countries such as ours, again non-Western countries, developing countries, they started to be impacted upon. So, what happens is media globalization slowly starts to affect these countries where the advent of satellite television starts to happen. So, the audiences starts to receive something new, something which was not local, and thus these production practices were affected. The local production practices were affected. So, this is a kind of an idea that media globalization affects the third world countries or the developing world in a manner in which their own local productions get affected. So, this is something not good for this kind of societies. They wouldn't take this kind of ideas in a very constructive manner. Now, as I had pointed in the previous slide, if you remember, the argument that with the advent of media globalization, the nation state is on its way out. The political nation, which was the central idea, which was the political idea, which was the economic idea, was no longer viable because of the way in which media globalization had given away with the concepts of the center and the periphery. No longer were media messages being bound by nation boundaries, and with the opening up of countries such as India, the underdeveloped world, the third world countries, and many other countries during that time, the unprecedented flow of media, global media flows into these countries, gave credence to the argument that the nation state was on its way out. The nation state was no longer required as a central authority because we see the nation boundaries being breached by media signals. So, theories in globalization started to dream of a world where these transnational corporations will overthrow these nation states, So, and this argument actually, before the idea of media globalization, were also forwarded in the case of, if you remember, large transnational corporations in the corporate world, like big oil companies, big energy companies, and how their revenues were bigger than many countries put together. So, if you remember, we had big American companies such as ExxonMobil or Shell, which were large companies which were producing and selling oil across the world. So, these ideas were thrown during that period too, that theories of globalization will assume that slowly but steadily the transnational corporation would mean that the nation state would be on its way out. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but that's where the ideas would slowly progress. Although opponents of this demise of the nation state, they also view that uh, if at all the nation state continues, if at all the nation state survives this onslaught, they will be only as mechanisms of boundary enforcers. They will only be, let's say, as policy makers and nothing more. So, the state will no longer partake in the process of production. The nation would only be a policy maker, and the nation would only be an enforcer of a physical boundary. And thus, this concept started to take a flow. There were people who actually started to believe in this idea. Now, it's a very out of the world idea, but that's where media globalization and its theories were starting to argue in the middle, in 20 years back itself, 20 to 30 years back. Now, if you look at the term global, the term global is generally associated in terms of media globalization, and as well in terms of globalization, is generally conflated with the idea of the advanced industrialized nations of United States, Germany, Britain, Japan, etc. So media flow is no different. Media flows greatly emanate from these nation states. Media flow also greatly is produced in these countries. Now, what does this tell us is, this tells us that that the audience is somewhere else. They are the producers, so they depend heavily on outside audience, and thus they have to but how do I put it? So, they have to adapt the idea of capitalism to maximize their profit. So, media global giants are no different from any other transnational global corporation, in the manner that they depend heavily on foreign customers, one, because they are the producers, the customers are elsewhere in the whole world, and they continue this process of merging into entities and diversifying into different companies, and they sustain this global corporate ideology, because whatever they do is with the sole aim of maximizing their profit. So, capitalism is the bedrock of such an argument. So, they become newer companies, they merge with different companies. So, whatever needs to be done in an industrial manner is done, so that maximization of profit remains intact. The other idea is, for maximization of profit, is the idea of the content. So, media content, and content is one of the most important reasons how they globalize. So, media content is embedded in formats that have proved lucrative in different markets, if I may put it. So, let us say different formats embedded in different formats, in the sense that, let us say, a soap opera. let's say a reality show has been successful somewhere else, so this format would be used, because if this format is successful somewhere, this is a format for maximizing profit, so it would be used in different locations across the world. Territory doesn't matter as long as maximization of profit is done. So the same format would be used to embed content in a different territory, in a different locality. So nation boundary, state boundaries collapse the moment they do that, because it's not about local ethos to programming. Embedding programs into formats is a universal idea, an idea which is based on the idea of maximization of profit. So this is one of the reasons why the media global corporations actually go to different locations, different geographies, and are yet successful because they emulate successful formulas from other territories. So what happens as a consequence is the local media production and consumption process, which would have been there long before these media giants would have come into a particular country, they are increasingly overshadowed by this media flow, because they can't stand up to this increasing onslaught of transnational structure of media flow that these global giants bring to the table. So the local production process and consumption process is at the risk of dying out, at the risk of being compromised, at the risk of being sidelined at the onslaught of this global media giants. What does this do is then the same first image which Troilo had argued, this leads to a general homogenizing, or rather you could also call it this advent of modernity across the world. As I had pointed out, as satellite television coming to India as the advent of modernity, so this homogenizing trend is also might be called as the advent of modernity across the world by these media giants. And this is one of the most important reasons how media giants go and finish off these local media production practices, or if not at all finished off, then they would compromise with them, they would adapt with them, they will merge with them, so that the maximizing of profit still remains intact. So one of the important things that we understand from here is, despite all its cultural connotations, globalization still remains an economic phenomenon primarily. Because the bedrock of globalization still remains capitalism. The bedrock of globalization still remains the earning of profits. So media globalization is also, like globalization itself, is theorized in a manner that it is the imperative of the market forces. It's the imperative of the economy of in the way in which economy functions. So this bedrock of capitalism, this the theories of the market, this argument in favor of the market, this actually is forms the background to the ideological context necessary to legitimize this political, economic and moral base for the capitalist environment. It's because for capitalism to be legitimized, you need this premise that media globalization is primarily an economic phenomenon and it has to follow the imperative of the market. So this establishes this ideological context that media globalization is a capitalist endeavor and it legitimizes through this phenomena. On the contrary, with all the criticism of media globalization and arguments against capitalism, media conglomerates themselves would like to argue that they play a very important role to foster global citizenship. Which is a phenomenon, of course. They foster global social justice. Let's say climate change, the whole idea of fighting for climate change, for example. A global civil society which comes about because of social media, for example, let's say, and the role of global communication in these processes. So global media, they argue that they are not after all that bad. They are the ones who have helped in the conceptualization of these ideas of global citizenship or global social justice and so on and so forth. Now you have to see that some of these ideas also do have merit. We have actually noticed, for example, a lot of when we talk of global civil society movements, we talk about, let's say, India against corruption in early part of 2000. If you remember, late 2000, India against corruption movement, the Anna Hazare movement in Delhi. If you remember the climate change movement that is going on across the world, and so many other such on, and the Arab uprising, the Arab Spring Revolution, let's say, in the Middle East, where many of the fascist dictators were overthrown by the power of the people. You'd realize that some of these technologies and some of these media flows have also given rise to some of these ideas, such as they argue, like the global citizenship, global justice, and some of this cannot be negated in a manner. Yet such arguments actually also hide behind the fact that this kind of arguments are for only the few. This because this idea of media technology is still a technology of the rich countries. This idea of technology is still an idea of the technological elites in, let's say, a country like India, where there is a huge social divide in terms of technology, what we call as the digital divide. So such arguments also fall flat in light of these arguments, because technological elite is a thing to stay. There is a huge divide in society. In fact, Arjuna Padurai theorizes that such is the potential of this divide in the world, such is the potential of this digital haves and digital have-nots, that there is a potential of violence in the world, and we do see a lot of violence in today's society due to the divide that we have in society. So such arguments for media globalization in fact also have its fair share of criticism. How do we study media globalization then? How do we criticize media globalization in a country such as ours? Post-colonial discourse offers one of the most invigorating and meticulous framework, because to analyze this kind of media production and consumption which are global in nature, because it represents a framework for studying this ideological effects of colonialism, and you might as well call it neo-colonialism, because the thinkers who contribute to the idea of post-colonial discourses in theory today would very well know the effects that are economic, cultural and social, which are very much true in the case of this kind of neo-colonial production and consumption processes. Thus, you will notice that post-theories such as post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-colonialism offer a scope. So there is this scope of studying media globalization today through this critical theoretical frameworks, because they can examine these dynamics of colonialism in today's global era and question those concepts which were very much the essence of colonial studies, such as resistance and hybridity. So post-colonial theories would help you in formulating a critical analytical view. It will provide you with the theoretical formulation to criticize and analyze the idea of a global media flow, because these neo-colonial concepts needs to be understood, in the phenomenon needs to be understood and questioned, and concepts such as resistance and hybridity needs to be understood in a far more better way. The questions then that we need to ask to the flows of media, to the flows of global production houses is, and the effects of the global media production houses is, how does then local networks and audiences accommodate this kind of overlapping narratives of global, national and local identities? Because if you notice, there is a constant erasure and rewriting of local, national and global identities, because there is an overlapping of the local and the global. The second is, what are the implications of such national strategies of control? So we are talking about the ideas of control on global and transnational flows. Many nations have brought about different legislations on global flows of media, on television consumption by, and so what are the effects of these strategies, the national strategies? How do nation states affect these global flows, and in turn how does it affect the consumption pattern by national and local communities? And number 3, which in essence forms the very basis of all the discussion that I have done in this last 2 lectures, is the idea is, where is after all power located? Is it at the end of the fulcrum, or is it on the nodes of the matrix? So this constant location, the constant search for the location of power is what should constitute our answer to the debate on media globalization today. Thank you.